Okay, so session 4 is called Putting It All Together, Creating Your Own Class. But before we dive in, I wanted to ask all of you, I mentioned how I take a lot of continuing ed and I want to like teach everything right away. And I realize that's not possible. And so I try to come up with one or two, maybe three things that I learned that I really want to remember. So I want you to come up with one thing you learned in the last session that you want to remember and share it in the chat box. And I'm going to head over to the chat box and see what you guys are thinking. All right, participants and chat. There we go. Okay. Imitate, integrate, innovate. Yes, I know, right? That's how most of us learn. That's how I learn. The cultural impact on interoception. Oh yeah, right. I definitely, yeah, that's a big one. Small dose graded exposure in yoga classes. Yes. The goal is to do less, not more. I know, right? It's nice when somebody gives you permission. Pepper your classes with somatics, but don't oversalt your yoga asana with all somatics. Yes, yeah, you don't want to scare your peeps away, changing too much too soon. Give them a little bit, see if they like it, and then get feedback. Yes, somatics allows you to experience natural human movement, which we haven't felt since childhood. Yes, or if you're like a big fat, like little kid like I am, you want to bring more people on board. I just always want to have little kid playground experiences. Okay, exploratory cueing, inquiry versus aesthetic. Yeah, they're both good and they both have their reasons. Chunking down a practice by doing a short regular yoga sequence and then doing a body scan check after, or have somatics at the start and at the end of a sequence. Yeah, we'll get into today, how to do check rechecks like I've been doing, because it's a really nice way to introduce your students to new concepts and ideas and get them to buy in, because they have that before and after experience, which kind of solidifies for them the purpose. Ask more questions. Yes, increase awareness of how the body moves, check, recheck, repetition. Yes, I know, right, Julie? It took me a long time. I used to always teach a brand new class every week. And then, I realized, no, that's actually not how we learn. I became a beginner in other movement modalities. And I was like, thank goodness they're not teaching a brand new thing every week, or I've never learned anything. Small movements to help connect the body in the context of asana practice. Yes. And then it says, please try muting and unmuting. Oh, that's for somebody else. Okay, cool. I'm glad that there were some things that were takeaways for all of you. Reminder to practice regularly with other teachers and other modalities. Yes, 100%. Like, get yourself out of your little box, see what's out there, what you like, what you don't like. I often learn just as much from taking classes or workshops from teachers I don't end up liking the material as ones who I do, because I learn what I maybe don't want to do when I teach. So yeah, get out there and explore. That's Karen. Hey, Karen. Okay, I'm going to close the chat box just for now, and let's go back to the PowerPoint. Share. Okay, and let's go to kind of, it's not showing me what I want to see. There we go. Okay. All right, slide 2, slide 3. So this brings us to our objectives for this final session. Objective 1, learn how to apply principles of regression and progression to somatics and yoga asana. Review key concepts and terminology related to somatics. Explore creating sequences as a group, in pairs, and on your own. All right. Oops. Okay. So, regression principles for somatics. Just trying to move this a little. There we go. When selecting a somatic sequence for a class, you may want to consider the yoga poses that you are using the sequence to prepare the body for. So for example, today, there's a very clear through line. Oh, and I wanted to mention at the end of your class outline for today, I recommend taking a class with Julia Klein on Yoga International for further study. That class is all about eagle pose. But it's similar to this class. And I was thinking, gosh, like they would be perfect kind of go-togethers because this one is a lot of external rotation of the hips and that one is a lot of internal rotation of the hips. And this class that I taught today was inspired by a class that I took from Julia. She's an incredible teacher. You can find her on YI, and I highly recommend checking out her work. So, an effective way to do this is to first consider the directions of movement required for the pose. So just in case you're unfamiliar with directions of movement, we're going to do a short overview of what they are. Okay, so yes, here we go. So directions of movement for the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder. And that is where your humerus bone connects to the glenoid fossa. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 directions of movement we're going to talk about. So the first one is flexion. So if you just reach your arms up in the air, that is shoulder flexion. And then shoulder extension is the opposite. And I guess, you know what, I can look at my piece of paper if you guys want to take me away from the PowerPoint for right now. I'm going to share. Yeah. All right. So extension, extend your arms, your shoulders behind your back. So we've got flexion, which is confusing because a lot of times teachers will say, extend your arms up to the sky. But as far as terminology goes and being able to communicate with clinicians and doctors and physical therapists, you want to know these terms. So shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, shoulder internal rotation, shoulder external rotation. Those are pretty obvious. Shoulder abduction is when you move away from the midline, and shoulder adduction is when you move your arms closer to the midline. Circumduction is circles. And of course, it's not like a perfect circle. We explored that yesterday with those FRC controlled articular rotations, right? You hit flexion and external rotation, you get stuck, that's good. You have bones, you internally rotate, and that'll get you around and back down. Okay, so next one is, so this should say scapulothoracic joint, and I will share my screen real quick and show you on mine, just so there's no confusion. So this is my original PowerPoint, and then we prettied it up with Yoga International style, but I know that we'll fix it right away to this because these are directions of movement at the scapulothoracic joint, not the glenohumeral. All right, so first one is protraction. So if you reach your arms forward and then really reach them forward, hopefully you feel your shoulder blades move apart. That's called protraction. If you reach your arms up at about shoulder height and you don't bend your elbows and you squeeze your shoulders back toward your spine, that is retraction. And then we've got elevation. So taking your shoulders up to your ears. And let's see, I'll stop share and kind of follow along here. So shoulder scapular elevation, shoulder blades go up, and then scapular depression, shoulder blades go down. So feel these in your body, do them with me. So we learn not just from top down, but also from bottom up. And then upward and downward rotation of the scapulas. So your scapulas, they're triangular in shape. So we just did protraction, which is apart, retraction, which is together, elevation, which is up, and depression, which is down. but the shoulder blade is super, like, it does a lot of other things. Even, it posteriorly tilts and anteriorly tilts and tips, but these are the basics. So upward rotation is when the bottom tips of your shoulder blades swing out and up. So as you bring your arms up, you're upwardly rotating the shoulder blade. And then, of course, the reverse, as you take your arms down, you're downwardly rotating the shoulder blades. All right, pelvis. This one's a good one to stand up and feel. So anterior tilt of the pelvis. I'll turn to the side. You think of your pelvis like a bowl, and you're going to spill the water that's in the bowl forward. That's an anterior tilt. And then posterior tilt is the opposite, when you're spilling the water backwards, usually referred to as like happy tail, sad tail, or tuck, untuck. And then we've also got, for the pelvis, elevation and depression, which is usually referred to as like a hip hike. So if I hike my right pelvic bone, ilium, up towards the bottoms of my right rib cage, that's pelvic elevation on the right, which automatically creates pelvic depression on the left. So pelvic elevation and depression. Depression is usually just not cued that much, because it just happens as a natural consequence of hip hiking or elevating one side of your pelvis. All right, hips, flexion, extension. So a couple different ways we can flex our hips in standing. So flex your right hip, that's hip flexion. But if I do this, I am flexing both of my hips. And then hip extension, I could reach my leg back and I'm extending my right hip. But I could extend both hips by doing this. Internal rotation, just like the shoulders. If you roll your femur bones in, that's internal rotation. External rotation, femur bones roll out. And then just like the shoulders, glenohumeral joint, when you move a leg away from the midline, that's abduction, abduction. And then when you move your leg back in, that's adduction. So you could do it with both feet on the ground. I just abducted my legs, and then I adduct and bring them back. Last one, circumduction, again, like the shoulder. So you're circling your femur and the hip socket. That would be with my foot off the ground. But you could also do it with your foot on the ground. So that's called a reverse action. Circumduction. Okay, so I'm going to switch us back for a moment to the PowerPoint. All right, so regression principles for somatics. Once you've identified the direction of movement for the yoga pose or poses that you want to teach, say, it's a peak pose class where it's just one pose, or it's a multitude of poses. You want to consider how the somatic sequence is a regression of that one pose or multiple poses. Okay, so that brings us to what is a progression and what is a regression. And from exercise science, this terminology is used regularly. And so I'm going to apply it to yoga asana. So a progression requires greater coordination and control of more body parts simultaneously. A regression lessens the stimulus on the student, allowing them to focus more singularly on a specific body part or aspect of a movement. When you choose a progression or regression, you're looking for the version of an exercise that makes it more optimal for your students so they can move better. And so ideally, you want to select an exercise that is challenging enough to improve your students' motor skills and movement skills, but not so challenging that they can't maintain control. And this goes back to the idea of progressive loading, progressive overload. This goes back to the idea of graded exposure. It goes back to the Goldilocks theory, right? You want to keep people learning and growing and getting stronger and more mobile if that's their goal. But you don't want to do too much too soon. And so it's always about finding appropriate progressions and regressions. And here I give an example of bird dog versus warrior three. And just in case you're not familiar with bird dog is when you are on your hands and knees and you reach your right arm forward and your left arm back. Or of course, the other way, you're on your hands and knees, and bird dog is left arm forward, right arm back. So Stuart McGill, I believe, calls the bird dog like one of the basic three or something. It's a very popular physical therapy exercise, strength and conditioning, warm-up drill to help find stability in your center while kind of connecting to those anterior and posterior oblique sling systems. Okay, so that brings us back to the next slide. Okay, so what do progressions and regressions mean in yoga? Because say in strength training, it could mean lifting heavier weights, or it could mean finding more power and velocity and speed, say for an athlete. In say Pilates, it might be going through the traditional repertoire of exercises and getting to the more advanced exercises in the repertoire. So what progressions and regressions mean in yoga, since the type of movement we're working with are yoga poses, yoga asanas. If we just say yoga poses are shapes that we create with our body that have specific types of alignment, and we agree that that's kind of a definition of a yoga pose, then a progression occurs when it's more challenging to maintain the alignment of that yoga pose or shape. And the opposite, a regression occurs when it's less challenging to maintain the alignment of the yoga pose or shape. Sounds so simple, right? But it's not always. So some poses lend themselves very well to a variety of progressions and regressions, whereas others may only have one or two. So there's this picture of me doing a one-legged handstand, and you can see how that is warrior three. But for most people, this would be a progression because we're not used to walking on our hands. We're not used to pushing our body weight with our hands. And so even though it's the same shape, it's really the same pose, it's a change of orientation to gravity, and that makes it a progression. Okay, so there are specific factors that you want to consider when you're regressing or progressing a yoga pose that will help you with your sequencing, that will help you decide what things to put into your classes and your private sessions, when, where, and why. The first one is load. So the definition of load is the force exerted on the body. And this force can be internal or external. And sometimes you'll hear this referred to as internal or intrinsic load, or external or extrinsic load. So those names are synonymous. I'm just gonna make sure I'm in the right place on my paper so that when we switch, I don't lose you. Okay. So example of internal or intrinsic load would be an isometric contraction. And poses don't move. We flow from pose to pose and there's movement, but the pose in and of itself is an isometric contraction. It's like a statue. So we are already, getting a lot of internal or intrinsic load by practicing yoga asana. What we're not getting is external or extrinsic load, unless, of course, you're adding things to the practice, or you're doing it in addition to your practice. So adding an external or extrinsic load would be, doing poses with TheraBands, doing poses with cork bricks that have some weight to them, using dumbbells while you're doing your yoga poses, or doing all of those things separate, right? Getting your external load somewhere else and your internal body weight load from your asana practice. So generally, a progression means increased load, increased challenge. It could be internal or external. And then a regression is a decreased challenge, and that is a decreased load, and that load can be internal or external. Okay, another factor to consider when you want to regress or progress a yoga pose, and that is range of motion. So I have the definition of range of motion here as refers to the distance and direction a joint can move. Each specific joint has a normal range of motion that is expressed in degrees. I'll take a quick sip of water. Last night I was massaging my cheeks. I'm used to talking all day long and teaching. It's just been a little while because I haven't been traveling. Okay, so for example, tree pose. If you do tree pose and your foot is on your calf versus having your foot on your thigh, the foot on the calf is less range of motion than having your foot on your thigh. So we would say that foot on the calf is a regression, and that's decreased range of motion. Foot on the thigh is a progression, and that's increased range of motion. But as I always say, it depends. And it especially depends with the hypermobile population. And I'm going to bring that up because I took a fantastic course with Jules Mitchell and Catherine, and I'm blanking out on Catherine's last name, but she does a ton of research on hypermobility. And she's a strength and conditioning coach. It was an online course. And I remember so clearly the percentage of people who practice yoga that are hypermobile. I'm not sure exactly where this number came from. I'd have to go back and look at it at the, because they cited all the references, is 80%. So that means when you show up to teach a class, 80% of the room is hypermobile. And it makes perfect sense because we like to do things we're good at. And so somebody who's hypermobile and has lots of range of motion is going to be attracted to doing yoga asana because it comes easily to them and they'll feel good at it. And so it just makes sense. So keeping that in mind, a lot of these typical definitions that might apply in, say, exercise science and strength and conditioning, if we're talking about dance or gymnastics or yoga, where we've got a large hypermobile population, it might be flipped. So I don't want you to believe me. I want you to feel it for yourself. So let's come on up to stand and let's try tree pose both ways. So let's start with, I'm going to do it on my left leg, and I'm going to put my foot on the inside of my left thigh. These pants are really slippery. And find my tree pose. There we go. All right. And I want you to do the same and just notice how it feels. And then come on out, take a moment, shake it out. And then do the same side and place your foot on your calf or your lower ankle. So for me, I actually have to work harder in this version. And that's not probably going to be everyone. But because I'm hypermobile, in this position, there's a lot more perturbation. My left ankle has to work harder. My left glutes have to work harder. Whereas when I do this, I can just put my foot there and I can be like, hey, let's have a latte. Yeah, let's talk about the world, right? And just kind of hang out here because there's no stretch in this for me. So just things to think about. I'm curious. Why don't you guys chime in the chat box? Which one was easier or harder for you? And I'm going to take a peek. Was it easier to have your foot low on your calf or ankle, or high up, or the same? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yes. So if you all take a look, there's a lot of different answers. People are having, On the calf, easier. On the calf, harder. On the thigh, easier. On the thigh, harder. Both are just as difficult. Both are just as easy. So I know so many Andy Fords. But I think it's interesting. So we might traditionally think more range of motion, harder, less range of motion, easier. It depends. So just wanted to make sure I said that. Yeah, you could put your foot on the inside of your knee joint. There is plenty of research showing that that is totally fine and okay. In fact, there's an orthopedic test called the Stork test, and that's exactly what they have you do. So that's one of those yoga myths that's always fun to bust. All right, gonna go back to the PowerPoint. Share screen. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Relationship to gravity. So another factor that you can consider when you're trying to regress or progress a yoga pose. And the relationship to gravity means the direction and orientation of the gravitational pull on the body can make the pose or exercise more or less challenging. And so in general, it's a progression. It's more challenging when your relationship to gravity is more challenging, right? Meaning you're not lying down, you're standing up. And then of course the regression would be a less challenging relationship to gravity. So, sitting or kneeling would be easier than standing or inverting. So here's another example that we're going to feel in our body, and that is Warrior 3 versus Supine Warrior 3. So let's start with Supine Warrior 3. We'll do that together. You lie on your back. Take your arms overhead. Bring your right leg up to the ceiling. And there you are. You are in Warrior 3 on your back. And then, of course, if you want to see what it feels like on the other side, lift your left leg up. Okay, and then come on up to stand, and we'll do Warrior 3 on both sides. So pick a leg, any leg, and find your Warrior 3. And then test it out on the other side. Okay, and then let me know in the chat box which one was easier, which one was harder, however you want to say it. And I will head to the chat box and see what you all are saying. Standing was easier. Yep. Supine easier. Standing easier. Easier lying on the floor. Standing easier. Supine easier. All right, wonderful. So as you can see, not everyone has the same experience, even though in general, you would think that relationship to gravity, it's always harder, standing than it is lying on the ground. Here's why. This is a portion of this I teach in my creativity meets science immersion. And so I've definitely taught this before. And usually it's a room full of women and one guy. And this is just what happens. And everybody says it's easier lying on the floor except for the guy. And of course, the guy says it's not, because if you don't have 90 degrees of hip flexion with your knees straight, it's going to feel awful, right? Because you're here and you're like, right, with that sound effect, as opposed to just standing up and doing Warrior 3. Of course, it can be a shoulder thing too, but usually it's the leg in the air. And so people who are hypermobile, naturally flexible, easily have 90 degrees of hip flexion with the knee straight. Supine is easier. And if you don't, then supine is harder. Yep, supine more challenging for range of motion, standing more challenging for stability and strength. You got it. So as much as I like to try to break these things down for you into categories, and it's super important and helpful to use them, there's always an exception. Okay, Next slide. So we covered load, covered range of motion, we covered relationship to gravity. This is going to take us to open chain, closed chain. Okay, so wait, I skipped one. Okay, open chain. So open chain are exercises where the hands or feet are free to move. And closed chain is exercises where a hand or both hands, a foot or both feet are fixed in space and cannot move. The extremity, meaning the hands or the feet, remain in constant contact with an immobile surface. So in yoga, that's usually the wall or the floor. But if you are at the gym, or if you have chairs, it could be, your hands are on a chair, your feet are on a chair, exercise machines. I teach Pilates on the apparatus, so there's a lot of closed chain opportunities there on the Cadillac and the Reformer and Wonderchair. So again, if we look at the example of Warrior 3, let's experience it open chain, meaning just regular, right? With only your left foot on the floor. And then, it's open chain for both of your hands and for your back right foot. And then, of course, you can do it on the other side, or if you want, let's just do it on the other side and let's close 2 more chains. So place your hands on the wall and then lift your back leg up. And now we've got 3 closed chains and 1 open chain. For most people, this is easier. Now we could do the hardest one, which is where you have your foot on the wall. So now I have 2 closed chains and 2 open chains, but usually this one is the hardest. But you guys can try it and let me know what you think. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about open and closed chains here. So usually when it's an open chain, your global mobilizer muscles are working, right? Because say, for example, if I'm doing, hand to foot pose here, I'm going to have more connection to, shut that off. The muscles around the joint, the smaller muscles around the joint, because I don't have to use the big ones to hold my leg up. But then when I let go and I have to use the big, thick, strappy muscles to hold my leg up, I'm not going to have the same kind of connection and proprioception around the joint. And that's kind of a tangent. And if it's not, it's like a whole nother rabbit hole that I probably shouldn't have gone down, but I figured I'd touch on it. Because there's also partially closed kinetic chains that we will get to. Do we get to those? If we don't, I will make sure we do. But there's a note about closed and open chains that I want to get to in the next slide. Oh, and then let's see, chat box, let me check. Yes, we cannot diagnose hypermobility based on what we observe, Bryn says. Yes, exactly. You are 100% right, because it's a collagen disorder. Yes, but if you do look around the room, you can see who's super flexible and unstable and who is like really, more on the tight, stiff end of the spectrum, and how everything they do, or everything you teach, each of those 2 people will experience in very different ways. Yes, so much good stuff on hypermobility. I love it. There's actually a book coming out in, I think, January, and my friend Jules Mitchell is writing the foreword for it, and she said it's amazing. I don't know the name of the woman who's writing it. I need to get that. Okay, so let me go back. yes, please don't go up to somebody in your classroom and say, oh, you're hypermobile, right? That's scope of practice. We are not clinicians. We are not doctors, unless you are, but you still wouldn't do that because you wouldn't, diagnose somebody on the street or in a class. That they would need to come to you as a patient. All right, open chain, closed chain, and yes. So I often expand the traditional textbook definition of closed and open chain to include any part of the body. And that's because it helps me create sequences. So for example, say you're in plank pose and you do it with the crown of your head touching the wall. I'll often call that like a closed chain, even though the textbook definition is only hands and feet, because it just helps me to come up with ideas for teaching and regressing and progressing. And I also do the same thing for anterior, posterior, so back body, front body, lateral side of the body, touching the floor or the wall. Say, for example, we can feel this one in our body right now. So if you do eagle pose, standing up, so we can do that real quick, like, right? You can even just hug your shoulders, or if you want to wrap, there's your eagle pose. And then you try it lying down. And you say, oh, wow, like there's a closed chain for the back of my body, from my tailbone to my head. And that's going to give me some proprioceptive feedback and information when I come back up that might be helpful. Or maybe in the standing version of eagle pose, every time your private client does it, they fall over because they're always collapsing on the side of the waist. So you say, no big deal. Let's try it on our side and see what happens. And so you come into eagle pose and then they collapse, right? So you could say, well, push your left foot into the ground, lift your knees up, right? Hover your head and try to, let's see, you can't really see, but rather than just, lying in bed, see if you can use the muscles along the right side of your body and push into the floor rather than collapsing. And then you can cue that same kind of hip hike and lateral body connection when they're upright, because they've experienced it with a closed chain lying on their side, so to speak. Things to play with, things to think about. All right. Lever length is next. So let's see, share screen. Okay, so, oops, there we go. Another factor to consider is lever length. Definition of lever length is moving the weight farther away from the fulcrum, increases the lever length, and increases the challenge. To regress, you would move the weight closer to the fulcrum. So example would be supine leg lifts with straight legs versus with bent knees. Now, we also know about biotensegrity. And so, the biomechanics of levers and pulleys, and, that our bodies are like buildings, and we use that same sort of mechanical engineering to apply to the body, we know is not actually 100% true. But I still find that this lever length concept is really useful when sequencing for clients and classes, regressions and progressions. So let's feel the example here, and then we'll play a bit. So if the increased lever length is the progression and the decrease is the regression, let's feel it in our bodies. So if you come onto your back, you bend your knees to tabletop, and then we do toe taps. So you inhale, tap your heel to the ground, exhale to lift. Inhale, tap your heel to the ground, exhale to lift, or breathe however you like to breathe. This is a, physical therapy exercise. It's a regressed, what we call pre-Pilates Eve Gentry exercise. So keeping your spine still, meaning not letting it arch each time you tap a heel down, is much easier for most people with their knees bent than with their legs straight. And again, also matters what your arms are doing. So I'm not really using my arms in either one of these. So using your arms can often make it a little bit easier. But for most people, this longer lever is a little bit more challenging. And then of course you could do both legs at the same time. So just notice like how low can you go with both legs before you arch your back versus legs in tabletop. They can be together or apart, we'll do together. How far can you go down with bent knees before you arch your back? And for most people, the longer lever is more challenging. And the lever length idea or concept is pretty simple because decreasing the lever is just bending a knee or bending an elbow. So that's something to think about when you are working with people. Okay, back here. All right, unstable surface. When any part of the body is on an unstable surface, such as a BOSU, that's the like half dome blue thing that's black and flat on the bottom. Physio ball, that's those big, giant inflated balls. Gurney ball is the same thing, but it's about this size. We use it in Pilates. Balance board, Airex pad it's like a thick pad that's kind of mushy. The unstable surface usually is a progression, and the stable surface is a regression. And you probably experienced that maybe doing Warrior 3 on like a squishy foam block versus on the hard floor. All right, next slide, sensory deprivation. So you can progress a pose by having, especially balance pose, by having people close their eyes versus have them open. Or say if somebody's really used to doing everything with mirrors, taking the mirrors away can make it more challenging. All right. Frequency, volume, duration. So in exercise science, this would be like increasing the number of reps or the time, but in yoga, it could mean, say, taking 1 yoga class a week versus taking 4 yoga classes a week, or, maybe it's holding a pose for, say, half a minute as opposed to maybe 2 minutes. The increased challenge or the progression is the increased number of weekly sessions, repetitions, or time in the pose or exercise. And then the decreased challenge or regression is obviously decreasing the number of sessions, repetitions, or time in a pose or exercise. Okay, so with all that being said, we're going to do a quick review of just a few things about somatics before we start creating sequences and classes. So just a reminder back to the first day, what the definition of somatic exercises is. Somatic exercises are gentle movement patterns that shift your central nervous system to create new muscular habits. These exercises are performed consciously with the intention of focusing on the internal experience of the movement rather than the external appearance or result of the movement. And then here's a definition of preparatory exercise. I have a whole chapter in my book on this. When I teach my Creativity Meets Science immersion, we really deep dive into preparatory exercise. I used to call this corrective exercise, but Joanne Elphinston, who I interviewed for my book, who I highly recommend you checking out. She has 2 fantastic books and she's super smart, said that just like we're shifting from changing the word chronic pain to persistent pain because it's nocivic, we are shifting, hopefully I am, from calling things corrective exercise to preparatory exercise, because corrective exercise implies that something about you needs correcting. And we all have different movement patterns and ways of doing things. And so if we can just think of it as a preparatory exercise, meaning it's the use of movements and postures to produce desirable changes in movement strategies, whatever those may be. Therefore, minimizing or eliminating compensation and producing efficient movement patterns. So, for example, a preparatory exercise that we did yesterday was Groundhog Day. And we did that before and after the prone salutes to see if doing that somatic sequence improved your ability to do the preparatory exercise. Another example, this is from the pre-recorded sequence. So when you did the sideline palm slides in the pre-recorded sequence, the preparatory exercise that was a check recheck was the hug roll, where you were lying on your back with your knees bent and you would roll your head and chest side to side, hugging the block. And then hopefully that improved after doing the somatic sequence. And then another example is from the pre-recorded sequence. The check recheck was side bending banana. So it was like a sliding movement, waking up the side of your body. It was also a lovely passive stretch. And to see how that changed, if at all, after doing the somatic sequence. All right. Review of body scanning. Body scanning is used in all three of the somatic methodologies that we are learning about in this training in this weekend. Hammer Somatics, Feldenkrais, and with Bartenieff, when I've taken classes, there weren't quite, we didn't have like overt, we definitely did body scanning, but I got off track. I was thinking check recheck. All three of them do body scans, which involves pausing and noticing where you are in space to facilitate internal awareness and neuromuscular reeducation. So body scanning can help enhance proprioception, and it can help students maintain the changes that occur in their movement practice. And I think that's really important because we can improve our proprioception by learning new movements, trying all different types of movements and exercises. But I think maintaining the changes comes with awareness, and that's just obviously one of the things I love about yoga. And it also, I love how it exists in somatics too. So there's that time to pause, to do the body scan, and to like top down and bottom up, take note of any changes that you may have experienced or felt after doing the somatic sequence. Okay, so now we're going to create a mini class as a group. My bound together thing kind of fell apart. That's okay. So how does this work? What we're going to do is we are going to come up with a check. And the check could be either a body scan or a preparatory exercise. So you notice sometimes I did both, sometimes I just did one or the other. And then after the check, we are gonna pick a somatic exercise or sequence. And I have a little asterisk. This can be an exercise from the pre-recorded sequences. And then also in another slide, I give you some resources for places to find more somatic sequences. Then the recheck, which is the exact same thing as the check, and a peak pose. So when I create a sequence, I always think of the peak pose first and work backwards. So that's how we're going to do it. So example from finding the Y and wheel pose yesterday. So I was like, okay, peak pose is wheel. And then I thought about all the different somatic sequences and what directions of movement were similar to what's required in wheel. So the most obvious one is spinal extension, but I could have picked a somatic sequence that helped improve shoulder flexion and external rotation, because that's also required. I could have picked a somatic sequence that helped with wrist extension, because that's also required for wheel. I could have picked a somatic sequence that helped with hip extension, because that's required for wheel. Right? So these poses, it's never just one direction of movement. And that's why you could create a class series or a workshop and say, teach a wheel class, for 4 or 5 weeks in a row, once a week. And each time the somatic sequence was for a different direction of movement, Okay, and then as far as a body scan, I did right and left body half scan, but like say today, I did imprint in the sand as the scan. The wheel pose sequence, I had us do, prone salute. So we were on our belly and we did Shavasana on the belly. So I could have done a body scan on the belly. And then for preparatory exercise, I chose Groundhog Day because it's extension and rotation. And while wheel pose doesn't require thoracic rotation, when you improve thoracic rotation, it almost always improves spinal flexion and extension. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose it. It also tends to be something that people struggle with, and that when they get better at it, it really helps them get out of pain. And so that's another reason why I picked that one. Okay, so next slide. So we're going to create our own mini class. So first, we need to come up with a peak pose. And what I'm going to do is I have like stickies. And this will be my first time doing something like this. This is what I do
I'm just calling you in, just giving you a time check.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we can, because I know we have until 4:30 for Q&A, and it's 3:20. Correct. So maybe if we do say, I guess it depends on what people want, if they want to do more sequences together or more Q&A. So I am open to, just doing one of these and then going straight to Q&A, or doing more, depending on what you think. Okay, so I am going to stop share. I'm going to open the chat box and more sequences. Groundhog Day, that was the one we did yesterday where you had the block between your knees and a block in front of your knee. And we did that. It's in the pre-recorded sequence as well. Okie doke. So somebody want to shout out a pose in the chat box that we want to deconstruct? Triangle. Perfect. See, first early bird gets the worm. All right. So our peak pose is triangle. So the first thing we want to do is determine the directions of movement for triangle pose. So I will come into triangle pose, and then you can start calling them out. So what's the direction of movement happening in my left hip in triangle pose? And then, of course, I'll take a peek in the chat box and see what you guys are saying. Yep, external rotation. All right, so we've got left hip is externally rotating. All right, how about my right hip? Yep, internal rotation. Okay, so let's get to shoulders. What direction of movement is my left shoulder doing? Yeah, we could say retraction or protraction, depending, right? So if I kind of squeeze my shoulder blade back to my spine, it's retracting. If I protract, I'm pushing away. Abduction, yes, it's moving away from the midline. And yeah, so I think, yes, and external rotation. So let's do external rotation and abduction. All right, so left shoulder is external rotation, that's the abbreviation, and abduction. All right, how about the right shoulder? External rotation, yep, and abduction, yep, pretty much the same. So we'll do that. Okay, so all we have left is spine and pelvis. So, and this is going to depend on your anthropometrics. Anthropometrics is a fancy word for, do you have short arms and legs and a long torso? Do you have a long torso and long arms and legs, right? So let's do spine. What directions of movement are happening in my spine right now? Auntie Ford has all the answers. I love it. Okay, we've got lateral flexion, we've got rotation. Yeah, and then I would say, again, with torso length, let's see if I can tuck in my, so if I were to put my hand on the floor, that's a lot of side bending or yeah, you know, the word that you just wrote. Whereas if my hand is on the block, yeah, I have to rotate to get here, but I don't really have much side bending happening. So, right, it's going to kind of depend on the length of the torso and like if I choose to use a prop or not. Yeah, you could even just say neutral. So, so for spine, so if you have a class full of people, it's going to depend. For some people, there's going to be, I think for most people, there's rotation to get there. Lateral flexion or side bending is going to happen for some. And then let's see, what was the last one? Rotation, lateral flexion. Oh, yeah, if somebody is, you know, more like this, right? They sit at the desk all day. They might feel like they really have to do a lot of extension to get there, to get, you know, that to happen. Where somebody else who's like floppy gymnast might actually feel like they have to flex to get there. So just putting it all out there. I'll put neutral-ish. Yeah. I think, you know, moving your spine in all kinds of ways is going to help prepare for triangle. Okay, pelvis is last. So triangle pose. Say if I start here, and you know, everyone has their ways of liking to do triangle pose. We've got 4 choices with the pelvis. There's anterior tilt, posterior tilt. So anterior, posterior, neutral, right? There's elevation, depression, neutral. I think it's, you know, going to be kind of, let's see what people are saying. Yeah, neutral-ish. It's going to depend. Sorry, there's stuff there. On the person's body. Most people can't move their pelvis at all once they're in triangle. I can because I'm, you know, pretty hypermobile. Yes, depends on how they're doing it. Okay, so let's focus on, we've got plenty for the hips, the shoulders, and the spine. So that is going to, so we can pick a somatic exercise or sequence next, or we can pick a check recheck. So I'm going to open it all up to you. If you think of all the pre-recorded sequences that we've covered, either live or ones that, extra ones that you have the recordings of. Is there one maybe that you're like, oh, we should do this because it's going to help with that? Yeah, exactly. For sure. Yes. So we could do palm slides, right? Because that is a lot of protraction, retraction. It's a lot of spinal rotation. You're working upward rotation and downward rotation. So yeah, I think, you're mostly you're in adduction. Your arms are closer together as opposed to farther out. So it wouldn't help with that, but it would help with other things. Hip external rotation from today. Yeah. I think that would be a great one for triangle pose, because in the one we did today, we were internally rotating one hip and externally rotating the other because we were doing that Z sit. So, and that's what happens in triangle. So that one I think is kind of like a no-brainer. But I like shoulder slides as well. For a check recheck, how about lying on the side with arms stretched forward with a thoracic twist? Yes. Palm slides. Yes. Leg slides where one leg slides out to open. Yes. So on day one, when we were lying in the X and we started and you just let your leg kind of flop and slide out and then internally rotate and come in, that would be perfect. I love that one. Anita, Garrett, yeah, straddle leg rotations. Yes, I think what you're talking about. I always teach take your triangle on a walk. It's not really a somatic exercise; it's just more like a preparatory exercise. Yeah, the star sequences for sure, because that's that shape of abduction of the arm, of the shoulders and hips. Yeah, somatic version of deer pose in slow motion. Cool. Okay, so you guys have got it. There's so many of them. So let me write down some of these ideas, these brilliant ideas. So we could do the figure 4. I'll put SS for somatic sequence. We could do the palm slides. We could do the X with the, like, I guess we call them the heel slides. I just heard one AirPod kind of die out. And so we've got lots of choices for the somatic sequence. We could do any of these. They're all really good. So the next thing then we need is a preparatory, a check, recheck. So, yeah, mimic on the floor what we would do in standing. Absolutely. I love that, right? So triangle pose on the floor is one of my favorites because you really get a sense of where your body is in space. So yeah, that would be awesome. Okay, so if we do, let's say we decide to do the figure 4 for our somatic sequence for triangle pose, one we did today. What do you think would be a good check, recheck? So when I taught it today, I did the roll at the very end as the check, recheck. Didn't I? What did I do? Yes, that's what I did. But say instead, there is some sort of preparatory exercise, and it could be an FRC exercise, or just anything you have learned that has to do. Yes, triangle with feet at the wall. Love it. So shout out some checks and rechecks of a preparatory exercise, meaning something that you think people would really feel a difference. I can think of Supta Baddha Konasana. Yeah, Z-sits for sure. Gate pose, pyramid pose. Pyramid pose with this one, we did a lot of external rotation, and pyramid is more just flexion extension. So you could try it and see. They might feel a difference, but I think, there was one of those like cobbler pose, right? We actually did cobbler pose. So that could be your, your check, recheck. You could be really FRC hip rotations. Yes. I was thinking evil, like Pilates, physical therapy, like you could do clams, right? Clam exercises, those ones everyone hates, but I bet it would be better afterwards. You could do with or without stretchy bands. Yesterday's floating gait with hands interlaced. Yeah, for sure. I love that. Yes. Okay. You guys have totally got this. This is amazing. Okay. So let me write. There's so many to write down. I don't even know what to put for the check rechecks. There's so many good ones. But I think what we will do then is I'm going to take a little poll. So let's do the raise your hand. Or actually, I kind of we'll do the raise your hand. Raise your hand if you want to create another sequence or if you want to go right into Q&A. Oh, sorry, you can't do it loud. Raise your hand if you want to do another sequence. So there's 64 of you, and I'm going to look and see if we get a majority raising their hands. We're going to do another sequence. If not, we'll go right into Q&A. Okay, we've got 27. So a little less than half. There's 64, 27 want to do another sequence. So I don't, Oh no, it's 26. Okay. 25. No, 26. Yeah. Okay. So that's less than half. It's going down to 24. So let's go into Q&A is what I'm gathering. Is that right, Serena?
Because based on the question you asked, that is what it seems like. Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just want to make sure I didn't flip it in my mind. I've been known to do that. Okay, perfect. So let's jump into Q&A. Before we do that, I'm just going to show you the last couple slides, and then we will jump right into Q&A. So yes, a lot of times when I teach this live, or all the time, we split up into pairs and practice teaching the sequence that we just created to each other, or you split up in pairs and create a sequence, the two of you. Because this is online, what you can do is come up with a sequence, film yourself teaching it, and share it in the Facebook group if you want some feedback on it. All right. And then just a reminder, you don't have to teach everything you've learned this weekend in a single class. Instead, try teaching one or two new exercises at a time. Okay, more resources. So this book here called Mindful Movement, I showed at the very beginning on the first day, by Martha Eddy. And I think I said, if you only buy one book about somatics, buy this one. If you only buy 2 books on somatics, get the second one as well. That's the one by Thomas Hanna. I have the very old version, but there's updated, the cover looks a little different on the one now. Here's a link to, we changed the subtitle, but that's my book, because a lot of you asked when and how to get it. So you can click on that link, and there's the information, as well as you can sign up for my email list if you want to get a discount on the book and find out when it's available. Things that I use when I create my classes or somatic sequences, Feldenkrais with Alphonse on YouTube. He is my favorite. There's this one sequence where you're lying on your back and you have your hand on your shoulder, and we do, it's like rotation, and he says, let your hand make friends with your shoulder. Anyways, he's just, so much of a teacher is liking the personality, and I think he's great. For Hanna Somatics, Susan Koenig is my favorite. But of course, when you pull up these on YouTube, it'll say, if you like this, look at this, it's kind of like Amazon. You'll see tons more. But I think her stuff is great. For Virtenia Fundamentals, Alexandra Beller offers online classes, and I've taken them, and I think she's fantastic. She's based out of New York City, and she's through the Vartenia Institute in New York City. Okay, questions. I am going to go back to stop share and Q&A.